I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Leon Brenner, a research fellow at the University of Potsdam and lecturer at the International Psychoanalytic University, Berlin. He is a training analyst, studying member of the APPI, and a founder of Lacanian Affinities Berlin. His latest book on the subject of the psychoanalysis of autism is called The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language, where he presents a novel account of autistic subjectivity from a Lacanian perspective. His book was just published a few weeks ago and is available as part of the Palgrave Lacan series. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Please note, if you're listening to this episode on the Rendering Unconscious podcast stream, there is a video of this conversation available at YouTube. Just search for Trapart Film at YouTube. TRAPART Film at YouTube, or Rendering Unconscious Podcast. If you enjoy Rendering Unconscious Podcast, please take a moment to go over to Apple Podcasts and give us a rating so that we can reach more listeners. Thank you. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. From Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. For more information, you can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
So maybe I'll start at the beginning. A lot of people ask me, why did I even start working on the subject of autism, which is a subject that's very close to my heart today. And it's a funny story because I started being interested in autism after listening to a podcast. So here we are. But it was a different podcast, unfortunately, called laLAB, a very famous one. And they have a very unique episode from 2014 called Juicevos. And it's a short episode about autism and specifically about a child called Owen, an autistic child. And it portrayed, well, laLAB portrays stories quite beautifully. So they portrayed this story quite beautifully. But the gist of it is that Owen was just seemed to his parents like his brother, just a regular normal child. And at the age of 2, he started, let's say, retreating into his own world up to a point where he was not speaking. And it was quite hard for the family, which kept the spirits up. And they say that Owen had like a very special interest as a young child, and that was Disney movies, and he was very into that and watching a lot of Disney movies. Also sometimes repeating the words he hears there. So the parents tried to fill his life with the things that he likes, with Disney characters, dolls, movies, etc. And the amazing point in the story, and what sort of got me thinking, oh, this is an interesting phenomenon to investigate, is that at a certain age, after Owen does not speak with his parents, does not communicate with them in any way, his father comes to his bed and he takes one doll of the parrot from Aladdin, right? And he puts a little blanket over his head, and he speaks to Owen using the voice of the parrot. That's Gilbert Gottfried from the movie, so very accentuated voice, and he's sort of mimicking the voice, and he asks Owen, using this voice and using this doll, he asks him, Owen, well, I don't remember exactly, but it was something like, Owen, how are you feeling? And he answers. And well, the father is quite shocked, and he continues discussing or asking another question, and Owen answers. And that was completely shocking to the family. But for them, or how they describe it, as an opening to his world, which eventually enabled them to build their relationship. Today, Owen is lingual, speaks, has acquaintances, friends, and a vocation. But it started there, in that moment, like that moment of communication. And that was obviously a very moving story. And I went to, well, you always go to Google Scholar, right, to find the paper. So I went and tried to see if this phenomenon can be explained. And I've mainly hit like many explanatory frameworks that weren't going very deep. That's how I felt, at least, yeah. And especially couldn't give a convincing explanation for this specific phenomenon that sometimes is called selective mutism. Being rooted in Lacanian psychoanalysis, I was, oh, of course, Lacan has something to say about autism. He has something to say about everything, right? So I went and looked around, and actually he didn't have a lot to say about it. And he only addressed autism explicitly, I would say, like a few times. Two very explicit times in 1975 in two conferences, one in the United States. And basically, Lacan was saying that autistic subjects are subjects of language, right? So they still are speaking beings. And that was my first thread. So it's like, okay, let's look at that from that direction. And then I started doing the research and read some really interesting books that unfortunately are only available in French, but got really into the subject, and eventually started a 5-year research, which culminated in the publication of my book just a few weeks ago.
And this is so important because typically, at least in the US, and I think a lot of countries, autism is really treated really behaviorally and is seen as this kind of like neurological issue. And psychoanalysts, of course, think about it very differently. So I think it's really important that this book is coming out in English.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think this has something to do with the, let's say, the normative aspect of my work, which was not only descriptive in a sense of providing let's say, a viable, interesting framework through which scientific and clinical understanding of autism can be furthered or enlarged, but also this normative aspect, which, again, you've raised the point, the behavioral therapy, right? What's extremely interesting about well, autism today, I think, is that there's so much research done on the subject, and some of it is groundbreaking. Of course, outside the field of psychoanalysis, there's extremely important research done on the subject, but there's a huge disparity between the way that scientists address autism and the way that autistic people themselves address autism. it's completely different. And you would say that it might be a matter of discourse, or in the sense of using the specific words, it might be a problem of you know, lack of access to scientific terminology. But I think it's paradigmatic, right? So scientists look at autism as a sort of an object to be investigated, and well, mostly this is a very prevalent attitude. At a certain point, scientists aim to cure autism, to enable people to rid themselves of their autism. Whereas autistic people, autistic advocates, and you know, there's this huge movement called the neurodiversity movement that has been formed by autistic people, and is well, has many autistic subjects participating in it today. And the idea that this movement progresses, and a lot of autistic people progress in their books, which I might recommend on some, and we can write some in the info, is that autism is part of who they are. It's a pervasive phenomenon that colors every different aspect of one's existence. And in this sense, by wanting to cure someone of their autism, in a way, it is wanting to cure someone of themselves, right? Losing something which is essential, singular to their subjectivity. And I think between these two approaches to autism, there's a huge, huge disparity, which I think psychoanalysis, in a way, is able to surpass or even mend. You know?
We'll say more about that.
Yeah, so much to say. Okay, so how do I approach autism in the book? Well, I approach it as a mode of being. You know, this is the basic assumption. It's a way, a practice of existence. It's one way to exist in the world, right? In psychoanalysis, at least the school that I belong to, there is no normal, non-pathological existence. There's only ways we can sort of deal or exist or have a relationship with a reality. And well, Freud described three, I think this might be an accurate assumption, that he described three different mental structures, sort of three different ways to exist. These are neurosis, perversion, and psychosis. And I think Jacques Lacan, well, I didn't mention this, but obviously I'm well endowed in the Lacanian school, and my book is strictly Lacanian in this sense. Jacques Lacan adopted that from Freud, and for Jacques Lacan, these are three subjective structures. Now, I think what is unique about psychoanalysis, and what distinguishes it from the field of philosophy quite clearly, is the fact that a philosophy aims to maybe uncover or construct a truth which is universal and beyond time. Yeah, in a sense, the philosophy of Plato is relevant for us today, as long as it had to do with this kind of philosophical truth. Whereas psychoanalysis is a practice that is based on people coming to the clinic, and in this sense, people take part in the social and society, and society has is inseparate from subjectivity, because society changes through history. We also see that subjectivity changes, right? So in this sense, when we talk about psychoanalytic truisms, or let's say structures, we we necessarily have to assume that these structures change with society. So while in the time of Freud, and that was more than 100 years ago, we might assume that the sum of humanity available to Freud, at least, could be, let's say, assessed in terms of these three subjective structures. There is no reason for there today not to be more. And let's say this is my basic assumption, and what I strive to sort of demonstrate in my book, the fact that autism, in fact, should be viewed as a fourth singular subjective structure in line with the three common subjective structures that Freud and Lacan talk about. Now, this is crucial also from within the field of psychoanalysis, because since its, let's say, birth, if one can say that, autism was considered to be a form of psychosis, right? So from its very early case studies that we see in psychoanalytic literature, we see that these cases that today, in hindsight, we describe as cases of autism, at the time of their deliberation, I mean the turn of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, they were described as cases of childhood psychosis, right? And well, it's not so far-fetched to view autism in this way, because the symptoms, the way that symptoms manifest in autism, sometimes these manifestations sometimes can be conflated with those that we see in psychosis. There is something that is quite similar in the sense of we see some alterations in the use of language, repetitive behaviors, let's say what Kanner called aloneness, a tendency for closing yourself from the outside world. This, of course, reminds us of Freud's notion of the end of the world and the cataclysm of the world in psychosis. So psychiatrists and psychoanalysts at that time were very much confusing the two. Now, this sort of conflation has not so much dissipated even from within the Lacanian field, where today a lot of people still argue that autism is in fact a form of psychosis, sort of saying that, what Lacan argues is the structural cause of psychosis, the foreclosure of the name of the father, is still very valid for autism. And in this sense, I've heard some interesting theories, which I respectfully disagree with, but interesting theories which situate autism on these different poles of psychosis, if you can call them, paranoia, schizophrenia, melancholia, and autism in this sense. But in this book, I try to very much show and demonstrate that this sort of assumption has to be, in a way, false, and that by assuming that autism is a singular subjective structure, we gain a lot. It's an extremely fruitful hypothesis that opens up a lot of place for theoretization and also for clinical practice as well.
That's wonderful. I'm so excited. I have your book ordered, but I don't have it in my hands yet. But I'm so excited to read it. It sounds really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm really glad that there's a move towards, in psychoanalysis, of course, but it seems in the greater culture as well, towards understanding that people have different ways of being in the world. We need to move away from this idea that scientists have had for so long, that there's a norm or a healthy way of being, and then there's all these deviations from the norm, because really there's just an infinite myriad of ways of being in the world, and we need to stop with that.
All right. Yes, the deviation, in fact, if we will use this word, is a way of existing, is the way of existing, right? It's mm, it is a question of one's suffering, which brings someone to the clinic, not the fact of being perverse or psychotic or neurotic. It's the question: do you suffer as a neurotic? And then you come to the clinic and try to work through this suffering. And the idea is not to cure one of his or her neurosis or psychosis or perversion or autism, but to find a way to exist and to be, well, in best of cases, enthusiastic about life in this way. Should we get really deep into Lacanian terminology, or yeah? Okay. Well, again, the book is quite specialized in the middle. It has 2 chapters that really meticulously go through some suggestions that I give for viewing autism through Lacanian terms. Whereas the 7th chapter of the book, I think, is the one that is most, let's say, open for people that are not so much interested in Lacan. And in this chapter, I also provide what I call the autistic linguistic spectrum hypothesis. So, but we'll get to that, yeah. But maybe we can start with this more Lacanian approach to subjectivity and see how we can also understand autism in this way.
Wonderful.
So very basically, I'll try today not to really go into jargon and stuff like that, but I'll try really hard. But let's say, according to Lacan, very basically, one's existence is based or rooted in a certain, let's say, intersection or interrelationship between the body and language, right? Between a certain, a living, a vivacity, what in French is called vivant, and language, right? So on the one hand, it is a structural theory, because we're talking about language, linguistic structures, linguistic mechanisms. Lacan talks about metonymy, metaphor. Later on, we discuss mechanisms such as repression and foreclosure as linguistic mechanisms. So we have that aspect. But on the other hand, there's always an aspect which exceeds the form, the structural form. And in this sense, a lot of people call Lacan a post-structuralist. But in saying so, what we argue is that we always have to remember there is the question of the body, there is the question of the drive, of libido, right, or jouissance, right, in Lacan. So basically speaking, and this is something that a lot of people repeat because it's a nice metaphor. We have a baby coming to the world, and the human baby is not very sophisticated. I always tell this story that I was once in a farmhouse in Canada, and I was staying in this, it was a very strange experience. It was a farmhouse full of postdoctoral researchers that investigate dairy. But I stayed there just a couple of nights, and one night at 4 a.m. they woke me up and they said, "You have to come. One of the cows is giving birth." And we went in the middle of the night to see the cow giving birth. It was quite a magical moment, and I was quite surprised to see the calf, the little cow baby in a way, just coming out, and immediately gets on his feet and starts to walk around, walk around, look around, smell things. And that was, oh, this little cow is ready for the world in a way. But human babies are not so much like that in a way. Human babies are not ready for the world. Right? And the thing is that in the womb, and this is very hypothetical, there's a certain relationship of satisfaction between the child and the mother. Let's say the child has these needs, instinctual needs, and they're somewhat answered. Of course, this is extremely hypothetical because also in the womb there's some things that are not so comfortable for the baby as well. But what we say about this whole story is that the baby comes out, and then the baby has needs, but they're not satisfied. They're not answered immediately. And this is a problem. And at that point, in order for the caretaker to know that, let's say, the baby is hungry, baby is sleepy, baby wants a hug, etc., the baby has to address the caretaker, sort of communicate in a way. And in order to do that, the baby has to take on himself or herself, in this sense, assume this language, this let's say, this locus from which his needs can be articulated and then answered, right? At a very early age, this is the baby's cry, and the baby cries, and the caretaker knows, oh, okay, baby's hungry, I can feed him. And this is a great start, right, for subjectivity in Lacan, right? Now, what we say about autism, and here I owe a lot to a wonderful professor and wonderful Lacanian writer from France called Jean-Claude Maléval, which also wrote the foreword to my book, was kind enough to write the foreword. And he develops an extremely interesting theory about this moment in autism. So what Maléval argues, and I develop in the book, is that this moment where one has to take on himself language in order to address a need to the other is an extremely traumatic one. It is a moment where something of the body has to be, in a way, cut out and invested in a field which is outside of oneself, a linguistic field. So whereas, again, I'll try to be a bit more metaphorical in order to express my point here, is that where a need is something that rises up of the whole of the body, by expressing it in a articulated form, we necessarily reduce or lose some aspect of its liveliness. Something of the vivacity of this whole complete vivacity is lost and articulated in a demarcated way. Right? A good example I sometimes give is, you know, you ask somebody, it's a good example, because love is always a good example. So you ask somebody, why do you love this person? And he says, well, she's extremely smart. And then you say, well, you know, there are smarter people in the world. So if that was the case, you probably love a smarter person. You just go and find a smarter person. There's something specific about this person. You say, oh yes, she's smart, but also extremely gleeful, etc., etc. We can go on and on, but there's always a thing that language is unable to articulate in this way. Love, in a way, exceeds its capacity, hopefully, at least, to my view. I know I have Lacanian colleagues that disagree. So in a way, expressing this vivacity, this initial vivacity in language necessarily entails a loss of something of the living body, some aspect of the living body. Now, in Lacan, Lacan takes the Freudian notion of the drive, Trieb in German, not to be confused with instinct. Yeah? And he sort of reduces the list. Freud had a longer list, and he says, well, there's the oral drive, the anal drive, and Lacan also adds the invocatory drive. So this means whatever enters through here, and the scopic drive, the one with the gaze. And what Maléval argues is that what we see in autism is in fact a let's say, a reaction to this necessary loss on the level of the invocatory drive. So it's a question of the voice, and Lacan writes a lot about the voice. Also, if someone's interested, there's some interesting articles and books on it by Grandin on the voice in Lacan. And the voice and the invocatory drive have a very crucial role in constituting a relationship between the subject and language, right? So it sort of has a very initiatory role in this relationship. And what Maleval argues is that instead of, let's say, succumbing to this loss, instead of investing this liveliness, this vivacity in the other of language in terms of the voice, the autistic subject chooses to refuse this. There is a certain retention of the voice at that very initiatory level. Right? Now, without being libidinally invested in language in this way, we see that autistic subjects have some, let's say, different challenges or hardships even when they have to use language in order to construct their reality, right? So what we see is this initial retention of the voice, which is the structural cause, let's say, of autism. And then what we can call the symptomatic manifestation, right? Or however the autistic universe or autistic reality unravels for the subject. And this is a very different way than, let's say, neurotic subjects are used to. And this is why a lot of clinicians engaging therapy with autistic people oftentimes argue that it is so difficult to communicate. And in a way, and this is something that Lacan refers to in his 1975 lecture, he's in fact asked by one of the clinicians in the audience if he thinks that autistic individuals even listen. Right? And what Lacan says is that, well, the fact that they do not listen to you when you try to care for them in the way that you try to care for them does not mean that they do not speak and they do not listen, they do not use language, right? And eventually the goal of my book is to emphasize this point and to open up a possibility for a dialogue with autism, which is not done in a very, let's say, this is what brings me back to behavioral therapy in a way that that sort of tries to disregard language and let's say the fruitfulness of language in any form of therapy. And in a way, you addressing autistic individuals as people that need to learn something, learn how to behave, rather than learn how to find their unique singular way into language and through that into the social bond.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautifully put. When I was in graduate school getting my PsyD, one of my jobs that I had was as like a behavioral therapist or personal care assistant for an autistic boy. And I would go to his house like 4 days a week in the afternoons or like all day on Saturday and take care of him. And you know that included very behavioral things like helping him eat and go to the bathroom and things like that. But I definitely, I just tried to meet him where he was at. I never tried to get him to do anything he didn't want to do. He didn't really have any overt language. But, you know, I could tell when he didn't want to do something. I could tell when he wanted to go watch a movie. He loved Disney as well,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
especially Pinocchio and Dumbo. Those were his favorite
Mm.
movies. And yeah, and I just like, yeah, respected him and his subjectivity and tried to work with him instead of like forcing him to do anything. And then the people that ended up like taking the job over after I left was a different company. Like his insurance changed and they had to go with a different company. And I kind of helped in that transition to try to tell them like where he was at and that sort of thing. And they were like very behavioral therapists that were not
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
psychoanalytically minded at all, and they would like physically force him to do things and hold him down when he wanted to leave the room, and it was so horrendous to see. It was just absolutely horrible.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if there's one point, and again, I wrote this book uh, aimed at people with an interest in psychoanalysis, but again, the chapter where I discuss the autistic linguistic spectrum is a chapter I wrote with the hopes that maybe people that are also absolutely outside of the discourse can also gain some new insights or perspective. And basically speaking, the point that is so crucial to understand is that every let's say all work done with autistic people has to be based on the understanding that a solution has to be completely inventive and unique. And this is something that behavioral therapy tends to neglect, the fact that it offers a sort of a universal solution. Whereas autism, I think, is one of the exemplary cases where it is only the singular and unique solution that is invented by the subject himself that can lead to some form of lasting progress that doesn't come at the price of one's subjectivity itself. In a way, conditioning is a way of reducing the role of the subject in one's reality. Right? It reduces reality to a set of behaviors, of stimulus and reactions. So definitely, what I hope to get out there is a certain approach that is very attentful to these unique manifestations that we see in autism. And you know, it can be this love for Disney, which is an excellent, let's say, source for work, as we see in the case of Owen, that is presented this podcast. But you know, it can also be a leaf or a stick or a washing machine. Yeah, all of these could be, let's say, points of insertion into language. Right, and this is the goal, I think, in treating autism in general, is assisting the subject to enter into a certain relationship with language that can be useful in, first of all, let's say, mediating the world and these what is sometimes experienced as unbearable intrusions of excitation, of jouissance. Up to a point where someone can take on a certain interest and learn it and study it and become an expert in it and gain a unique kind of pleasure using this specific interest. And then to a point where someone's interest can be also articulated in terms which are, let's say, open to the social world, and make someone an active member of society and find a place to the world, in the world, find a place to be inscribed as someone in the world, right? But yes, I think one very interesting notion that I did adopt from some very important, I think, Lacanian scholars is the fact that in autism, we argue that there is no other in the sense of the big other, right? Now, this is a quote from a really interesting couple called Rosine and Robert Lefort. And they are considered to be the pioneers of autism research in the Lacanian field. They have one book in English. I think it's right behind me, The Birth of the Other. The rest of their books are in French. But they really started this whole, they based this hypothesis that in autism there is no big other. Right? Now, this is something that maybe is important to clarify, because in psychosis, according to Lacan, we also see that there is a foreclosure in the symbolic. Lacan calls this the foreclosure of the signifier of the name of the father. Whoever knows something about that, that's wonderful. You can actually read about it first in Lacan's Seminar 3. But what this means in a way is that language operates differently in psychosis, and that this is due to a certain erasure or total erasure on the level of the symbolic order, or the big other, what Lacan calls the big other. Now, what is important about psychosis, and Lacan stresses that quite clearly, is that while there is a hole in the big other, in the place where the signifier of the name of the father was, there is still an other for the psychotic. Right? So this is something that has to be emphasized. Whereas in autism, what we see, in a sense, is a complete foreclosure of the field of the other itself. Now, what does this mean? And not in terms which are a bit more, let's get a bit more linguistic, or maybe scientific, and a bit less metaphorical. What this means, in fact, is that for psychosis, what is erased or foreclosed is a specific kind of signifier which is in charge of some organizing capacities that the symbolic order has on the body, on reality, etc. Okay. But what we see in autism is that autistic subjects, in fact, have no access to the domain of the signifier. Right. Now, this might bring some people to say, oh, well, this means they are out of language. Right? But what Lacan only started to say by saying that autistic subjects are in fact quite verbose, that's a quote from Lacan, is that not having access to the domain of signifiers doesn't mean that you are not a subject of language. And this is something that I also develop in the book, this idea which is called the autistic recourse to the sign. Right? And here we're getting a little more, let's say, linguistic and a bit more specialized in distinguishing between what is a signifier and what is a sign. I'll try to explain this basically, and like whoever's interested, of course, can read about it in my book. But this is based mostly on Ferdinand de Saussure's theory and Jacobson's theory. When in modern linguistics and the field of semiotics, when we talk about language and how meaning is created, we don't view it so much in terms of a word that refers to something in the world. So let's say the word cat means a cat in the world. So this is not how modern linguistic views language. Modern linguistic views language as, well, I'm saying modern, but I'm talking about mid-20th century. But this type of linguistics, the semiotics, argues that a signifier is by itself empty. It doesn't refer to anything. A signifier, according to de Saussure, is in fact a sound image. It's a little sound, a, e, u, I. And the way that meaning is created is when different signifiers are sort of interposed and in a sense posed one against the other. And we have I, a, u, u, or like ka, a, t. That's a very simple word, cat. So we have these signifiers that are interposed, these sound images, and when they are interposed in a specific way, one next to the other, a specific time in history would say that the word cat means this. So this is how signification happens. Signifier refers to other signifiers, and through their interrelationship, a meaning can be established. Now, a sign, and this is sort of a take that Lacan makes on it. And it's interesting because he talks a lot about Robinson Crusoe when he does that in several seminars, which is a really good book. But he uses this to emphasize the nature of the sign. A sign is like a word that has one reference. Okay, so for instance, if fire would be a sign, sorry, smoke would be a sign of fire, right? Or, and again, this is controversial, so just for the sake of the example, the sign of the man and this sign of the woman on the public toilet means this is men's restroom or woman's restroom. There's one meaning for each sign, and this is how a sign functions. Now, Lacan argues that, well, we do have access to this domain of the sign when we use language, but that neurotic, perverse, and psychotic subjects all are disposed to using signifiers when constructing their sense of reality, when being in the world. This is how we make meaning. You know, the world opens up to us through its meanings. This is, well, we shouldn't say this, but it's a bit existentialistic or phenomenological in the sense of Heideggerian sense of things present themselves through their usefulness, through their meaning. And in a way, the world is a world of meaning. And this meaning unravels through the interplay of signifiers and the way that we utilize signifiers in this, in the unraveling of reality and the understanding of the world. Now, what we see in autism, and this is sort of one of my hypotheses, is that in autism, because of the retention of the voice, because of this initiatory refusal on the level of language, there is no access to the big other in terms of the locus of signifiers. But autistic subjects do have access to signs. And through the use of signs, they can compose an intricate, complex system of knowledge that can enable them to live a very satisfying life if they choose. Yeah, it would be a different reality. It would be a different way in which things unravel and present themselves. Meaning would be constructed in a different way, but it will be constructed. Now, in my theory of this autistic linguistic spectrum, I propose a certain, let's say, progression between several levels of implementation of the sign in one's relationship with reality, right? Starting from a point where, you know, this is a point which is, again, a hypothetical point which precedes language altogether, where there is no use of language in creating even a border from the world, in creating a me in the world. So excitation constantly invades the body, and this, we see this in autism in a lot of cases, to a point where the sign is used in dealing with jouissance, in demarcating it, and creating a certain border, right? A border that enables one to have some moments of, let's say, moments of peace, moments of existence, which is not constantly in the threat of destruction or self-destruction. Then using the sign, gaining a certain interest in language, seeing that signs are in fact things that one can play with and use in exploration. And this is, I think, one of the one excellent example can be found with one famous autism advocate. Again, I'll add this in the links. And she has an excellent video on YouTube. Unfortunately, she passed away last year, where she demonstrates her unique way of using language in a tactile way in her tactile exploration of the world. So this level is a certain fascination with language, using it in order to gain a certain satisfaction, which is personal, to a point where language is used to explore and create knowledge, create a knowledge about a specific field of specialization. And then to a point where language is, in fact, not so much used in using auxiliary objects in its incorporation, you know, these things that have to be in the environment, that have to do with this tactile sensations, but having a language of your own. And this is what, based on Maleval, I call the synthetic other. So this is not the big other as we know it, as the locus of the signifier, but a synthetic other, which is composed of signs. And after this, well, the sky is the limit. There's a terrific documentary from the Lacanian field called A ciel ouvert, like an open sky. And this is what Lacan says about the psychotic unconscious. It's like an open sky. But I think that we can also use it here in autism, in the sense that the synthetic other is like an open sky. It can be used for a variety, endless variety of goals, up to a point where in this spectrum we can call it the transparent pole of the spectrum, where we see people that are not even deemed as autistic and sometimes are diagnosed at the age of 30 or 40 and sort of understand, oh yes, now I understand why I was acting this way. But in a way, they even don't really notice that their use of language is different. And what I suggest is that each point on this spectrum, and I provide 4 different points, dictates a different clinic. And the work with autistic subjects on the level where a certain boundary has to be created with the body, a certain body image has to be created, is one clinic. And clinicians should be ready to operate in certain ways with a certain method when they work with autistic subjects right on this point. And this work should progress them to the next one, where language is used for the sake of a certain satisfaction and curiosity and pleasure. And this should entail a different clinic. Again, a clinic that is rich with objects, that is rich with an environment that can enable this sort of satisfaction. Then there's the level of being interested in a specific field, gaining knowledge, becoming an expert. This is a different clinic, right? And then the 4th clinic, and this is the one that we can in a way associate with what we see today with practitioners working with Asperger's syndrome patients, is a clinic of just asking yourselves these questions. What do I want from my life? How can I achieve my goals? Where can how can I, if I want a job, how will I go and do that, etc., etc. So you see there's 4 different clinical trajectories that are based on 4 different levels of linguistic functionality. And this is sort of what I try to progress in the 7th chapter of the book. And I hope somehow will have some effect on practitioners that also work outside of the Lacanian school. Maybe last thing I'd like to mention is that while my work was definitely based on the work of clinicians, of psychoanalysts, on case studies, on work that is conceptual, etc. I think the most important aspect of these, let's say, last 5 years that I've been conducting this research was my exposure to autistic subject literature, to autistic literature, to autistic writing. I think this kind of creativity is the one that impacted me the most. And something that I think is crucial for anyone that's interested in autism, or interested in conducting research, or interested in working with autistic subjects, is to go and read these books and listen to these autistic subjects that find it so important to get out to the world their idea about themselves. And one thing that is very much progressed by these really inspiring figures, and among them I can definitely mention Temple Grandin and Donna Williams, two excellent writers that inspired me, is that we have to remember that for autistic subjects, autism is not a thing that can be, let's say, excised or cut out. It is who a person is. And it's a matter of being autistic and not a matter of having autism. And I think this, at least this basic axiom or hypothesis, is the one that's the most crucial when starting and engaging with this field and subject in general.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point that, everyone can learn from different points of view. And like here in Sweden, of course, Greta Thunberg, she credits her activism and her ability to speak out because she has autism or Asperger's, because she doesn't care so much about these social cues that she's supposed to abide by. She sees something very clearly and she speaks out about it. And she also talks about how before she started speaking out, she became very depressed and she wasn't speaking and she got very closed off because she was so upset about the state of the world and how no one was taking care of it or addressing the climate crisis. And then ever since she started finding her voice and speaking about it, she's gotten so much energy, and of course a lot of energy has gotten behind her to address these issues. So instead of thinking that somebody has something wrong with them that needs to be changed, how about just listen to people and what they say about themselves and their point of view and learn from it?
Exactly. And the name of my book is The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language. And this is exactly where a dialogue with autistic people and autistic subject has to be initiated, exactly there. And from there, well, as you've just described, we're looking at subjects that are inspirational and can definitely change the world. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Leon Brenner. For more, please follow him on social media and check out his new book, The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language, available as part of the Palgrave Lacan series. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. From Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. For more information, you can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
lost them, yet bear no ill will. Down we on and yet bear no ill will. Either eager to get on. The show must go on with the show and succeed. Our show is glorious and pleasure, enchanting and enlightening. A goal that's just inevitable. There as are fucking every ridiculous digression. Get life, get detour wife, get have become a fortress of beauty and laughter in success and pride out right love each other's story all along. We want written has been decided, has been favor written.